Hey, Stewart's Chapel. Don Pierson here in Don Counts, and we're at the Counts home. This is Monday's devotion, September the 13th. Monday's devotion, September the 13th. I'm going to read two New Testament passages, both written by Paul. One is found in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, and the other is in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 9. So let's look at 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 9. When I was present with you and in need, in other words, I was weak, I was in need when I was with you, I was a burden to no one. For what I lacked, the brethren who came from Macedonia supplied. And in everything I kept myself from being burdensome to you, and so I will keep myself. If you remember Saturday's devotion, Paul also is speaking in Acts about making sure you take care of those who are in need and weak, supporting that brother coming up. And then he talks about it's more blessed to give than to receive. And I asked you if you were able to receive. The invitation or the devotion today is I've got entitled Striving Not to Be a Burden. Striving not to be a burden. This passage and the one I'm going to read here in a little bit over in 1 Thessalonians, Paul makes it very clear that he did everything he could not to be a burden. But it also says here in 2 Corinthians that he was weak and in need. But he didn't let the Corinthians, he did his best not to allow them to do it. But I want you to know, Paul did receive. Other brethren from Macedonia came and supplied his need. In other words, he received from them what he needed to be, that was lacking. Because he had a purpose, not to be burdensome. Let's look at that passage in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 9. Notice both of these are verse 9. 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 9. For you remember, brethren, our labor and our toil, for laboring night and day, that we might not be a burden to any of you. We preach to you the gospel. Both talking about how he strived not to be a burden to the Corinthians or to the Thessalonians. People of Thessalonica, did his very best not to be a burden to any of them. In Corinth, that was done. He was able not to be a burden because other brothers from another place came and helped him. They took care of his need. But in Thessalonica, he worked with his hands so that he would not be a burden. So, some key words, there are 4 truths in here. First of all, it seems to be that it was Paul's goal never to be a burden. That didn't mean he didn't have needs and was burdensome, but Paul he had a goal that he did not want to be a burden. The phrase is, I will. He says, so I will keep myself, not as a burden. That was his goal. He didn't want to be a burden. It was intentional. I kept myself from being a burden. It was a goal and it was intentional. It was a fact. I was not a burden. He declares that. It's a fact that they knew. It was a fact. He was not a burden. It was helped. He acknowledges that he had help in not being a burden. What I lacked, others filled. It's one thing to say I have a goal that I'm not going to be a burden. It's another thing to do everything you can intentionally so that you are not a burden. It's probably a good thing to be able to say I wasn't a burden. But you know what? It's also good to be able to say I had help. I had help. Sometimes it's good to say, you know what, I had some help and some of you helped me. Or sometimes it's good to say, you know what, I had some other brothers and sisters out there who helped me. You know, Several of you that watch these devotions are not from Stewart's Chapel. In fact, many of you. What I'm about to say has not always been true for me, but there's been times when it's been true for me. The task of being a pastor can be very lonely at times. It can be very burdensome. It's not unusual for me to hear and have conversations with pastors that are weary because they feel like they've been carrying that burden all by themselves, all alone. And they haven't had any help. But every now and then, I'll hear from a pastor friend who will call or text or communicate to me in some way the joy that he has experienced because someone, or maybe his whole church, came to his rescue in his time of need, when he was weak, and they carried him and his wife, or him and his wife and his children. I cannot remember a place of ministry that was really, really bad for me. That doesn't mean there weren't bad moments in ministries. I can't really remember a place of ministry that was really, really bad. I've known plenty of pastors that have been in horrific situations, but that has not been my case. Whether pastoring in North Carolina, I always felt loved and always felt like I wasn't alone. I never felt alone. I always felt others were doing their very best to encourage and strengthen and carry me. When I was a missionary in Belize, in those churches, I felt the same. As a director of mission, I felt the same. When I was with the convention, the fellowship of the other missionaries and the pastors and the churches I encountered were always more than enough. At Stewart's Chapel, I've never felt alone in this task. I've always felt that I had help. That's not the case for every pastor. Those of you that are listening from other churches, guard your mouth. Guard your heart in relationship to your pastor. Recognize that you are not the one who called him or put him there. That was a God thing. If they're not exactly what you think they ought to be, then maybe it's a time for you not to offer help, but for you to provide help. Of you that are pastors, I know you're striving not to be a burden. That's the title of this devotion, striving not to be a burden. I know you are striving not to be a burden. You ought to be doing everything you could as you were doing it to the Lord, striving not to be a burden. But sometimes your burden is going to get heavy. It's okay to ask for help. It will require humility to do so. Love you, Stewart's Chapel.